Thank you for showing your support and coming along this night tonight. I did say at the same time last year I was hoping for 100 every night that we meet, and I think we're well on the way tonight to continuing what we started last month. And I'm particularly delighted to be able to welcome John Mannion, our guest speaker this evening. John's subject, a largely forgotten story, post-war migration in Peterborough. Please make John Mannion welcome.
Yeah, so my story tonight, I could be talking to some of the converted probably. Post-war migration played a big part in Australia's, the way we are today, I think. How many migrants here who come out after the war? See, there you go. It's the sort of thing which probably you're aware of in the city, but it also happened in the country after the war, but most of the migrants didn't stay in the country, they come to the city for some reason. Every time I come down here I wonder why, but I won't tell you what I said to Colin when I saw him this afternoon. Something about why would you want to live down here, or why would you want to drive down here. Living is probably all right, it's just the driving. Yeah, so this story is Peterborough. I'll assume most of you know where Peterborough is. It's in the mid-north. Well, that's another thing about history. The mid-north. What a silly... It's the lower north, really, because it's not even in the middle of the state. It is in the mid-north, or what we call the mid-north agricultural area, northern agricultural area. And I grew up on a farm in what is the northern agricultural area. We still do crop there sometimes. I was a farmer, but not very successful. I've leased my farm like a lot of blokes did in the 1930s. History is just repeating itself in some ways. Back in the 30s, when tractors were coming in, a lot of blokes couldn't afford them, so they leased. Now when you look at a header worth maybe $300,000, you can easily overcapitalise. There seems to be a trend away from that. So there's one big landowner crops the whole district. He might do 10,000 acres in a year. He just hopes that it rains because he has to pay money out, whatever. Yeah, anyway, I grew up on the farm at Peakner, which is about 25 miles west of Peterborough. And Peterborough is one of Australia's former great railway towns. Back in the early 60s when I was a kid, so I am well over 50, a trip to Peterborough was a big day out for us living at Peakner. We had the old FJ Holden, and we drove across the Gatna Plain because that was a shorter trip to save petrol. It seemed like eternity to get to Peterborough through Gatna. I think even the pub was shut at Gatna, yeah, 61 it shut. So we used to go with Mum and my young brother because Dad was always away shearing. He was a shearer. And as we drove into Peterborough, we did hit the bitumen on the outskirts. We drove in from the west. There was a cluster of iron buildings on the left and the railway workshops and the roundhouse on the right. Peterborough was the largest railway centre in the state railway system outside Adelaide. It wasn't as big as Perry or Port Augusta, but they were Commonwealth as well. And the Port Perry to Petersburg Railway was built in the 1870s, extended in the 1880s, and it was become part of the principal east-west transport axis of the upper north, actually the whole country. And the coming of the railway brought prosperity to all the towns along the line until the 1970s. And back in the 60s and 70s, Peterborough was a thriving country town of between 4,000 and 5,000 people. Then after what was proclaimed a progressive move, the National Rail Track Standardisation of the 1960s, which goes back to the 1940s, that affected South Australians from Coburn on the border of New South Wales to Port Pirie, from Tarawi to Quorn, from Gladstone to Wilmington. When the railways moved out, they finally moved out in 1996. But it happened a long time before then. The decline was in the 80s. Left hardly any jobs. Left Peterborough a once proud town with less than half its population. And today it's estimated about 1,900. South Australia had two main railway maintenance workshops, Islington and Peterborough. And like I said before, the Commonwealth had a similar facility at Port Augusta. I won't go through the history of the line. The line came up through Peterborough in 1881, 82, and it gradually moved further north, reached Quorn in 1882. But the thing that really made Peterborough in the state railway system was the Silverton. It was well before the discovery of the Broken Hill mines. They extended the line up to Silverton because there was silver there. Then a couple of years later they found the Broken Hill lode. But that's really what saved the state. Actually, the state rail made a profit on that line, which made up for all the rest of the losses. Like I said before, the railway that went through Peterborough from Tarawi up to Quorn, down to Port Augusta, across to Kalgoorlie, was a part of the east-west or the transcontinental railway up till 1937. So So the little narrow gutted railway, which someone described as two pieces of wire, sat down on the dirt, carried the East-West Express. It carried livestock, it carried hundreds of thousands of sheep, lots of wheat and lots of soldiers during the Second World War. But it was principally built to carry wheat and virtually skirted Goyder's line up to Quorn, with the hopes that the country would prosper around Hammond. Hammond did take in a lot of wheat at one stage, up to about 400,000 bags in a year, which was a lot of wheat for that area. Sadly, it didn't last long. But the railways, as they extended, they became an integral part of the state-controlled occupation of new lands and expansion of mining, farming and pastoralism, and they were the mainstays of our early economy, not like now. And when they built that line across the Nullarbor in 1917, well, that really proved to be a boon to the mid-north. A little town called Eurelia, just north of Orroroo, there was a goods shed there. They shut the goods shed, converted into a railway refreshment room with silver service, waitresses, and that was for 20 years. That was the refreshment room on the east-west. You stopped there for 25 minutes while the engine got water. And one of the most famous diners in there was Don Bradman in his Australian 11 in 1930. They had a special menu for that trip. Anyway, I'm getting off the subject really, aren't I? The narrow gauge system of railways that centred around what was known as Petersburg was originally called the Northern System, and rail was an economic means of communication from the northern areas to the ports of Adelaide and Port Pirie, and to a degree Port Augusta. As I said, the extension of the narrow gauge line from Burns or Coburn on the border into Broken Hill really made the rail system. Then along came an American bloke called William Webb in early 1920s. Webb's an American, Commissioner of Railways or similar in America. He was brought out here to tidy things up. And he made Peterborough a divisional headquarters. I think it was 1923. They put a divisional superintendent at Peterborough. It's like Peterborough, SAR Peterborough Division. That was taken in the 1960s. Peterborough was originally Petersburg up to 1918, when the government, in a frenzy of patriotism, eliminated all names of supposedly German origin. We don't know how Petersburg was perceived as German. Petersburg was in Russia and was named after a bloke called Peters. Same as Edithburg. Well, they could have said Edith was a German. And by 1908, even though the railway had only been in Peterborough for over 20 years, there was up to 30 trains a day going through the town. Moving on to the prosperous period when Webb reorganised it, Peterborough had a population of 4,000, of which 2/3 depended on the railways, 1,000 directly employed on the job. There were 100 trains in and out daily, and the marshalling yard at Peterborough then was only less than a kilometre long. It was between two streets on either end, and I think the roadmasters had a hell of a job trying to put trains together in that short area. During World War II, thousands of Allied troops travelled by train from Adelaide through Tarawi, Gumbowie, Peterborough, Minbalara, Blackrock, Orroroo, Wallaway, Eurelia, Carrollton, Mookra, Hammond, Bruce and Kingswood to Quorn, where the SAR system connected up with the Commonwealth system for a trip along two more a little narrow-gutted thing, which is even worse, called the Central Australian Railway to Alice Springs. Also coming down that line was coal trucks from Lee Creek, coal trains, bringing coal down to Osborne Power Station, and so the line was very busy. In 1953 there were 300 railway cottages as such at Peterborough. They were built specifically for railway workers, and 750 railway staff drew wages of $24,000 a week back in the 1950s. A lot of these drivers got big money, particularly on overtime. The poor packers and the gangers, well, they didn't. They're the ones they carried the system. In the 1960s, the diesel-electric locomotives came along. They required little maintenance, and along came the standardisation of the track in 1968. The transport control monopoly held by the state government was abolished in 1966. Trucks became more reliable, roads were improved, and it was deemed by the politicians at the time that a once very important railway system was not important anymore. In 2007 or 2008, we are now, the railway still passes through Peterborough, some of the longest trains that probably ever passed through there, up to 1.5 kilometres long. They do stop in Peterborough occasionally. You can get the Indian Pacific to stop. But I think they worked out that it costs something like $10,000 a minute to stop the train over their whole system. They don't like stopping at Peterborough. Pacific National operate on a very cutthroat system. But they will stop. So the Coburn line still makes a hell of a contribution to the economy of South Australia. There's BMAX trains come from Broken Hill through Peterborough to Port Pirie. That's a special train just to carry sands from outside of Broken Hill down to Port Adelaide. The freight that goes across the Nullarbor is massive. Passengers, well, I think they're just a bit of a curiosity. They have to be fed and watered as well, which makes it even worse. There's no stock carried on trains anymore. Right, that's enough about the present. Let's go back 60 years. A few years ago I was a part-time project officer at Peterborough for an oral history project, and it was called Relaying Our Tracks. And the aim of this project was twofold. It was funded by the Federal Government, Department of Family and Community Services. It was designed to assimilate newcomers into the former railway town that seemed to have lost its direction after being abandoned by the state and the Commonwealth in this rationalisation, which went on from start to about 78. Peterborough was a town which was beginning to be populated by city dwellers, ex-cons, welfare recipients, all from outside the town. They were apparently at Port Augusta Jail. There was when you left Port Augusta Jail, there was cheap housing advertised at Peterborough. As far as this project went, it was a failure, and the funding body predicted it would be. But as a historian, I found it was an invaluable source of just getting stories and recording the oral histories of the many older established members and former members of the community who had scattered all over South Australia. And also this interview brought out lots of photographs, magazines, lots of documents which should have been destroyed when the railways finished, which a lot of people like souvenirs. Luckily they did. There was a magazine article I found which was written in 1973 in the Railways Institute magazine. And the story is called Baltic Migrants Arrived at Peterborough in 1948. I'll just read the article. This was written in 73. Few people would remember that it is 25 years ago since the first Baltic migrants arrived at Peterborough to be trained for railway work in South Australia. The Balts, as they were called, were the first displaced persons to come to South Australia as migrants, and they were accepted almost to a man by the local people because of their youth and their apparent enthusiasm to learn all they could of their new home and join in the activities of their new country. They were willing employees, well of course the Institute would say that, wouldn't they, who were prepared to work long hours and many shifts in order to help them establish themselves financially. But one of the most severe problems they had was the language barrier. One fireman could not understand the meaning of the word rest. His driver told him to have a rest. So when the crew arrived at its destination and went to the barracks, this fireman would not leave his engine, and so he slept on the footplate. He had been told to work his engine to Wilmington and back, but he was not told he could have a sleep. So he just slept on the job. And there was a couple at the migrant hostel at Peterborough. Peterborough did have a migrant hostel run by the Railways Institute. It was run by a couple of, I think they were English. And these lads were first encamped in tents at the side of the hostel, and later they had rooms which were Wiles huts, and there was a couple of Nissen huts. And it's recalled by some of the Australians that these young firemen would sit up late at nights drinking coffee to help them stay awake so they could study their rules and language to qualify as firemen and porters. Some of the older enginemen who were Australians found it very hard to converse and understand with the young migrants, and some of the young migrants found it hard to understand just what the enginemen were thinking. But mostly it was a happy association which was extended on for many years afterwards. Today we have a lot of those Baltic migrants listed among our senior staff members in the loco and traffic running and among the stations and masters' ranks. In the early days, most migrants wore gloves on their hands when doing hard and dirty work, and the reward for this was apparent when some of them left the railways and went into other positions, and some into their own businesses. The talented boys were pleased that they had protected their hands and fingers to equip them for delicate work in future life. There's a photograph that was accompanied that article, and it showed the first group of 18 trainee migrant porters at Peterborough, including names like Dukowskis, Sinkun, I can't pronounce a lot of these. I do know some of these. Nick Dukowskis went to Mount Gambier. Paul Diamantis lives here in Adelaide. Flavie Hodenoff lives in Adelaide. Joe Doniella lives in Adelaide. Arthur Clark lived in Adelaide, and so did Jacobson. That article described what was Corwell's immigration scheme. It was the start of it. It's been described as one of the best things that ever happened to Australia. And it was also described as the most humanitarian act that Australia has ever undertaken, but it hasn't done a lot since. However, that scheme really succeeded because Australia needed them as much as they needed Australia. In reality, this plan of Corwell's was a calculated plan in competition with the US, South America, South Africa and Canada to draft workers into the country without upsetting the domestic labour and the housing situation, hence living in tents. By the late 1920s, when the rail was established, there was very little maintenance done on it. Then along came the Depression, the Second World War, so there was even less. The railway system was taxed to hell, and during the war the Islington workshops were adapted to heavy engineering war production. So there was only emergency track maintenance and repairs, and this greatly increased tonnages and train movements under the war effort just saw the railway just virtually drive itself into the ground. So at the end of the war, the Australian railway system was in a crisis state. Many of these bolts who were described in the article were skilled men and women, but they were used as manual labour and literally dumped in outback railway depots and maintenance camps and regarded as foreigners and cheap labour. As time passed, however, the Australian people came to realise that these new Australians found what they were seeking, the chance to rebuild their lives in their new homeland at a time when Australia was still a colonial country populated largely by Anglo-Irish migrants. Australian society was dominated by the native-born, not the natives, the native-born at the top with the mentally ill kids, despite the propaganda that babies were the best migrants. Aborigines and migrants were generally overlooked. Now that article I read was written in 1973 and they questioned whether anybody would remember 25 years later. So here I was in 2005. How many people would remember them? I can't add up. It was a long time later, 32 years later. So 50 odd years later. So fortunately it was quite a few. I just got curious. This sort of got me off track as the project officer of this oral history. I went through the Adelaide White Pages and I found some of these names listed, so I just rang them up. And the blokes who answered the phone were a bit wary. But after speaking with their wives, they said, "Oh, this bloke sounds like he might be interested in your story. You better tell it." "Oh, who'd want to know what I did?" That was the attitude. But I did make a few appointments to come down to Adelaide and see them. And I was just fascinated by what these blokes had been through, where they were, what they'd done, and what they were doing now. I had lots of questions to ask them. The three I caught up with were Flavie Hodenoff. He was an Estonian who Australians called Freddie. Couldn't call a bloke Flavie, could you? And Povilas Diamantis, well, you couldn't call him Povilas, so they called him Paul. Paul was a litho. He proudly says he's a litho. And I wanted to find out where they came from, what the trip over was like, what they found when they got here, what they did before, during and after their time at Peterborough. And surprisingly, they opened up quite quickly to a bloke who they'd never met. This article that got me interested mentioned that these blokes were the first displaced persons to come to South Australia as migrants. You know, the impact of Arthur Corwell, the first Minister for Education. It didn't really register until I started some research. These 18 blokes weren't the first displaced persons to come to Peterborough. They were the first displaced persons to come to Australia. They were aboard the first Liberty ship to come from Germany to Australia. They left in 1947 on the US transport ship General Stuart Heintzelman. And I thought that was really just fantastic to find these group of blokes who were on the first displaced persons to come out from Germany. They didn't know each other before they left. They got to know each other pretty well by the time they got here. I suppose we better look at some pictures. Right, now this will just run through. It might distract you, but there's captions on the photos. Otherwise we'll never get to see them. Post-war Europe, Germany, 1947. All those people there nowhere to go. Yeah, like the aftermath of World War II is characterised by devastation and misery, which led to a seemingly insoluble problem. All these people with nowhere to go. Millions of people were crowded into refugee camps in Germany, Italy and Austria. They could not settle permanently in Germany, a country where they were disgraced, wronged and had no means of support. Many countries, including Australia, turned their attention to these DPs, and in 1946 we launched the Australia scheme, where 18,000 DPs, as they were called, would be accepted to increase the population for national security and economic development. Both sides of Parliament agreed that it was essential to increase the rate of migration as a means of attempting to ensure the security of the country. But the main hindrance was the shortage of ships. Paul was one of the older migrants. He was in his late 20s. Anyway, they got these US Army transport ships and they converted them into people carriers. The Heintzelman was originally an aircraft carrier. They sailed from Bremerhaven on the 30th of October 1947. This vessel was on its 5th DP voyage, the first to Australia. Arrived at Fremantle on the 28th of November 1947. Paul said to me, when we got to Melbourne, there was this bloke come out and he went, nee, 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 nee. And he did speak like that, didn't he? And he said we didn't know what he was talking about. Anyway, back to the Heintzelman. The ship held 729 men and 114 women from Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. There was a few women there, see. They were all young and healthy. They were fleeing the communism and they were all under 40. They had to be screened to ensure they were fit and healthy and free from fascist sympathies. They had agreed to be directed to live anywhere and prepared to work at any job in Australia for 2 years. The majority were destitute and demanded and expected little. They were fleeing destroyed and war-torn countries and they'd had a guts full of Russians, Germans and the bloody European war, they told me. They'd lived in camps for several years and they were just sick of it. And they wanted to come to a country where the word democracy was more than a word. And in return they would help build Australia's resources, which were run down and short of manpower. And they would lay the foundations for the country we live in today. Most of these newcomers were sent to rural areas where they were put to work on farms, in mines, in quarrying, railway construction, forestry, road and bridge building, waterworks, anything which required manual labour. And they were termed the bolts, a term not often heard today, actually bolts. They were later known as Caldwell's New Australians. They're called WOGs. Anything which was derogatory, mainly through ignorance and not racism. They were sometimes called Eastern European migrants. When they arrived at Fremantle, they were housed in a former army camp for several days. And then they got off the Heintzelman and boarded the Australian HMAS Canimbla, where they all said the food was much better and the conditions were much better than the Americans did. They disembarked at Station Pier, where you saw before, in December 1947, just before Christmas. And that Station Pier in Melbourne was to become as important to Australia as Ellis Island is to America. But we never really appreciated it as a country. The last migrant ship, the Australis, docked at the Station Pier in 1977. From Station Pier they were put straight on a train to Bonegilla. Special trains took them to this place near northeastern Victoria, near Albury, where they had a rest. They were received, they had medical examinations, they had basic survival lessons in English. You saw them there looking which way to Lithuania. Yeah, well, they didn't know what they'd struck. Now, living in a country which is no denying this, Australia is dominated by the eastern states and the capital cities, but it wasn't only Sydney and Melbourne that were influenced by the migrants. South Australia, and we are more than Adelaide, those who live outside of Adelaide, we are more than Adelaide. We also accepted many of the displaced persons. A lot of them went to Port Augusta, Port Pirie, out on the Nullarbor. Back to Peterborough. Peterborough accepted a lot of these migrants, more than bolts as it went on, to the point where there was 10% of the population were European migrants in Peterborough. A lot of them lived in the hostel, a lot of them just boarded privately because the hostel was too dear. Some of them lived in tents, just anywhere they could just find somewhere to put it, and they worked their way up to where they had some money, and they would become part of the community. Back to us newspapers again. In January 1948, an edition of the South Eastern Times, which was printed at Millicent, there was a rather insignificant one-column, 7-line article which read, "Bolts for railway work. 62 recent arrivals from the Baltic countries are in camp at Bangham, between Francis and Wolseley. They will be working on the broadening of the South East railways. They are all young men of strong physique." End of story. A bit over a month later, a similar article appeared in the Peterborough Times, 400 miles away. This one was new arrivals. On Monday night's express from Adelaide, 18 DPs arrived in Peterborough for duty with the Railways Department. They were all men of fine types. I don't know how they knew that. They came from Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, and after going a basic period of training under instructors from the Railway Institute, they will be employed as cleaners and porters. This one went a bit further. "We welcome them and hope their stay in our town will be happy and successful." Now, Paul Diamantis was the subject of both those stories, and he told me that after several weeks at Bangham in the southeast, in the sand and the mallee, 18 of these blokes were selected to transfer to the system at Peterborough, between Adelaide and Broken Hill. He said, "I had no bloody idea where Peterborough was, but it had to be better than here." The ones that were selected by the hierarchy of the State Rail, they had a good grasp of the English language and they were pretty well self-motivated. They could see they were good workers, and they had the prospect of becoming engine drivers in loco or as station staff in traffic. Now, Paul said to me that these were the fortunate ones. He thought they got off the track work, and he planned to become a big man in the railways, because in Europe, if you're in the railways, you're a big man. It was an important job. He found out otherwise in Australia. And when Paul was actually 30, when he left Germany, his first impression was Australia. It was so bloody ugly. The first things he noticed at Fremantle were the dry yellow grass and the dead trees. Nothing like Lithuania, which was green and densely forested. He noticed the public drinking, which was mainly done by Italians. He didn't find Bonagilla much better. He hated the heat as well as peeling potatoes, which he did for 3 weeks straight. At Bangham, the workers slept in tents and there was hardly any water. As you can see, they'd bathed in their tubs. The hostel at Peterborough was a bit better, even though the tents were a bit daggy, he thought. But he said, we were young, it was a big adventure. Ironic, they lived in Nissen huts, which had come from the Loveday internment camp. That come into play later on. They were initially designed to only house single men, this hostel at Peterborough, but in the 1950s there was mass migration from Europe. Most nationalities were represented at Peterborough, and so the hostel was modified to take families as well. And that hostel operated off and on until 1972. In 1975 it was demolished, it sold off by tender, and the funny thing is that no one knows where it went. There's one Nissen hut remaining on the site, and that's possibly the only Nissen hut in the state that's at the site where it was built. A lot of them were sold off and used on farms, but that one at Peterborough we want to list it on the State Heritage List. The local council think otherwise, but we'll have to educate them. Now, despite only staying at Peterborough for 4 years, Paul and his colleagues are still remembered by many older ones in Peterborough for their manners, for their behaviour, for their appearance, particularly by the young girls at the time. They said they were gentlemen and they knew how to treat a lady. But despite being generally accepted, life was difficult for them. They were homesick. They were derided to some degree, particularly by the local blokes who thought they were going to pinch their girls. They put up with a bit of racial discrimination. The most common was being called bloody bolts or speak English, you bastard. And that could be taken either way. Paul said you knew how to take it seriously or whether they were just having you on, just by the tone of voice. But it's really surprising that this influx of over 300 migrants in the country town where Australians had heard virtually no foreign languages in the streets, there was virtually no prejudice. Now, this has been attributed by the locals to the fact that Peterborough was a working class town with a very transient population. There was some fear of these strangers, but particularly amongst the young kids. There was a 15-year-old girl who moved from Maree to Peterborough for her schooling, and she lived with her grandparents in the 1950s, and she'd been exposed to Afghans and Aborigines, but she didn't know what to make of these bolts. And looking back, Paul says, we looked like wolves. We all had long hair and it was all pushed back, whereas the Australians had short back and sides. Now this girl wouldn't even go near them, convinced they would take her away. Another girl who grew up in Peterborough during the bolt era recalls how they would not even leave the clothes pegs on the line at night in case the bolts stole them. So life was a bit difficult for these blokes, but they generally mixed together a lot. Used to ride their bikes for miles and miles and go swimming and shooting, but they mixed with the locals in the pub and have a few beers, and they used to go to the football, they used to go to the races, and generally they were very accepted. And it has been said that friendships were difficult to establish at Peterborough because you didn't know where your mate might be next week, and that particularly affected a lot of school kids. But that hasn't detracted from some firm friendships being established. And there's always a lot of people come back to Peterborough whenever there's any big event. Now Paul Demantis is a bit of a character. He said Lithuanians have got a bit of sense of humour like the Irish. They're pretty sarcastic. He was telling me this story when he was at Bangham, when the ganger phoned the railway storeman at Mount Gambier for a bag of fish plate bolts to be sent up. And he was told, you've got bloody 60 bolts up there already, isn't that enough? And Paul said that learning English wasn't always easy as well. Who were you supposed to learn from? There was Scots amongst the migrants, there were Welsh, there were Irish, there were English, and there were Australians. And he said, which one did you understand? He said, it's a bit hard. And the other difficulty was they were often put together in groups of their own kinds. So they didn't have to speak English. They just spoke to each other, because a lot of them could speak 3 or 4 languages. And the ganger, well, he had to speak to no one. He just told them what to do by action. But like Paul said, we wanted to get on, so we watched, we listened, we asked lots of questions, carried notebooks and wrote down everything. But just living in Australia, Paul was curious what this thing called a water bag was. He was always told to take a water bag with him. He said, I'd heard of a water tank and a water bottle, but a picture of a bag of water, well, I just couldn't understand that. He said, I got very used to it. The other thing was the dust and the flies. He reckons it took him 5 years to get used to the heat and the dust and the flies. He left Peterborough after 4 years, and he met and married his Australian-born wife, June, and he lives at out past Mannion Road. He's well into his 80s now. He's always keen to hear about Peterborough. Now, Flavie Hodenoff was another bloke. Flavie was a little bloke who'd served with the American Army in Germany after the war. They got black uniforms rather than the green. They were peacekeepers. And he was very self-motivated. But when he got to Peterborough, he was very keen to be a fireman, but he couldn't understand this roundhouse rat, which was a little V-class steam shunt engine, which was so small you just push lumps of coal into the firebox. That's how small it was. That's on display down at Narracourt, incidentally, that little engine. Flavie stayed in the railways for 37 years of shift work, which his wife can attest to. He built his own house in Adelaide, and he spent over 3 years at Peterborough. He celebrated his 21st birthday at Peterborough. And he was there when the second group of bolts arrived, followed by many more. They didn't come in one big mass, they come in groups of about 10. And you can remember them all coming, how they all mixed together. And many families were separated as a result of this work contract. And Flavie had a girlfriend when he left Germany. She was Russian. When he left, he didn't know we'd ever see her again. This is before telephones were commonly used, and it was only letters if they ever got through. So Flavie just got on with life. Him and another mate, they moved out of the hostel because it was too dear, and they found a board with a German family through the Lutheran Church at Peterborough on a dairy farm, so they worked there as well as the railways. They gradually got on. They bought a push bike after they got sick of walking. Then they usually bought motorbikes, which were affordable. But it was still difficult. But these blokes who I've spoken to, they still remember the affection some of the older railway men in Peterborough displayed to them and their families. They had never forgotten people like Ray Shell, Dave Rosser, the Brennan brothers, Lionel Noble, Peter Smallacombe, and these blokes, quite a few of them are still alive, and they will never forget the gentleness of these migrants. They just said they were very gentle people. Flavia's girlfriend, Walia, she did come to Australia with her parents and her sister. They stayed at Bonegilla and she got in touch with Flavia through the Red Cross. But the only way she could move out of Bonegilla was to have a job. So Flavia found her a job as a domestic with the Casey family on a farm east of Peterborough. Now that was Tom Casey's family, Tom the politician. And she had to look after the kids. She told me that when she was at Bonegilla, a lot of the locals from Albury and Wodonga come to have a look at the bolts to see what they look like. She said they went away very disappointed. They thought we looked like them. And she remembers being given this some clothing to come to Peterborough on the train. Even though all these years later she remembers she had a bright pink raincoat. And she said, when you don't have much, you remember things like that. So the men and women were in separate accommodation at Bonegilla. So Flavia actually got her this job and she could travel to Peterborough despite not speaking a word of English, and they were reunited after she came over. She remembers the trip from Bonegilla to Peterborough well. She said she was given a packed lunch of sandwiches and a couple of eggs. All I had was a suitcase and a handful of papers and unable to speak a word of English. She reckoned she'd never waited so long for a train. And on arrival at Adelaide Station she could not ask questions, but a Lutheran priest must have been there to meet her and he advised her how to get to Peterborough in German. Walia remembers that the train trip to Peterborough was in the dark, so she couldn't see where she was going. And when she did arrive there was no platform, which was unheard of in Europe. She said, I expected a street with houses and shops on both sides. But all I found was a very long street, very poor, very scary, with one big hotel dominating the long main street. There's 4 hotels along the street, but this must have been the railway dominated. Walia admits she hated living in Peterborough. She didn't like the country, and Flavia reckons he'd be still in the bush if it wasn't for Walia. These 2 blokes remember a German, one of the earliest Germans in Peterborough. Peterborough was settled by German people. They remember Heine Koch. And he did a lot of work for these lads who couldn't speak, as they said it, we couldn't speak very well English. Walia and Flavia were actually married in Peterborough at the Lutheran church. They rented a little tin house near the hostel, and Flavia thought he renovated it for his new bride. She didn't think much of it at all, but he thought it was really good. They eventually rented a railway house, and Flavia found out it was very hard to get transferred to the city despite Walia's protests. Everybody used Peterborough as a stepping stone in the railways to get up the system. Tailem Bend was another one, Port Lincoln. But actually he did get there, he excelled on the job and he became the first migrant fireman on the SAR at Mile End. He liked his job and he loved to work freight trains back to Peterborough after the broad gauge was extended to Peterborough from Tarawih in 1970. After 37 years he agreed that it couldn't have been easy for Walia or any other of the railway wires living alone when the men were away on shift work. It wasn't only the women who felt lonely though. A lot of these blokes I've spoken to said they were lonely, and to overcome this loneliness they just worked. They took all the overtime they could. In any free time they had, they walked around the hills, they shot kangaroos and rabbits, they rode motorbikes, they played cards, they drank lots of beer, they even got onto the port wine which they couldn't handle, they gambled and they fought amongst themselves quite often. Because when you put all these blokes together in the hostel at Peterborough, you've got Polish, you've got Germans, get on the grog, old things surface, and quite often fights broke out. Yeah, there was a saying in Peterborough, birds shit on poles. That was the Germans. Now this talk only captures the early years of the post-war migration system in Peterborough, but it was replicated all over the state, from 1948 to the 60s. A lot of these towns like Tailem Bend, Port Lincoln, Port Augusta, Peterborough were microcosms of Europe really, and there's still quite a few did stay in Peterborough, and their first generation born kids are very proud of both sides of their family, but until me and the history group in Peterborough had actually did a photographic display, they'd never really felt accepted.